encourage you as we continue going through our study, looking at lessons from legends, to take the yellow insert out from your bulletin. And this morning we'll be looking at it's a matter of trust. So we talk about trust this morning. The legend that we're going to be looking at is Saul, the first king of the nation of Israel. Now, if you know anything about Saul, you know that his life demonstrates failure in many different ways. Failure in his relationship with God, failure really as a father, failure as a leader. However, I think we can take from that understanding that Saul is a failure within Scripture for the most part. We can take that as a blessing that God gives to us His Word in order that we see real people with real problems, and in doing so we can learn from them and hopefully learn in our own lives how to be better. I always believe that each individual we come across, whether it's through history and reading or study in some way, or whether it's a personal interaction with somebody, I always believe that we can learn something from everyone. Now, whether that is in a positive sense, where we can learn something to imitate from someone else, or the negative sense where we find out that there is something that we don't want to duplicate within our own lives. We can learn something, either to be or not to be. No Shakespeare reference there, but simply that aspect. Something to learn from. Something to either imitate or not follow through with. So the account we find this morning, we're going to find it in 1 Samuel chapter 15. You can look that up in whatever you use to read your scripture, whether it's an electronic thing or the Bible or whatever. You can follow along behind me. This morning I'm going to read from the New Century Version, just to give it a little different flavor for us, and then we'll switch back to our New International Version as we actually dig into the passage. So 1 Samuel chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to appoint you king over Israel." Now listen to his message. This is what the Lord All-Powerful says. "When the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Amalekites tried to stop them from going to Canaan. So I will punish them. Now go attack the Amalekites and destroy everything they own as an offering to the Lord. Don't let anything live. Put to death men and women, children and small babies, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." So Saul called the army together at Telam. There were 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Then Saul went to the city of Amalek and set up an ambush in the ravine. He said to the Kenites, "Go away, leave the Amalekites so that I won't destroy you with them, because you showed kindness to the Israelites when they came out of Egypt." So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul defeated the Amalekites. He fought them all the way from Havilah to Shur at the border of Egypt. He took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but he killed all of Agag's army with the sword. Saul and the army let Agag live, along with the best sheep, fat cattle, and lambs. They let every good animal live because they did not want to destroy them. But when they found an animal that was weak or useless, they killed it. Then the Lord spoke His word to Samuel. "I'm sorry I made Saul king, because he has stopped following me and has not obeyed my commands." Samuel was upset, and he cried out to the Lord all night long. Early the next morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul. But the people told Samuel, "Saul has gone to Carmel, where he has put up a monument in his own honor. Now he has gone down to Gilgal." When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said, "May the Lord bless you. I have obeyed the Lord's commands." But Samuel said, "Then why do I hear cattle mooing and sheep bleating?" Saul answered, "The soldiers took them from the Amalekites. They saved the best sheep and cattle to offer as sacrifices to the Lord your God. But we destroyed all the other animals." Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." Saul answered, "Tell me." Samuel said, "Once you didn't think much of yourself, but now you have become the leader of the tribes of Israel. The Lord appointed you to be king over Israel, and He sent you on a mission. He said, 'Go and destroy those evil people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until all of them are dead.' Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you take the best things? Why did you do what the Lord said was wrong?" Saul said, "But I did obey the Lord. I did what the Lord told me to do. I destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back King Agag, their king. The soldiers took the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice to your Lord at Gilgal." Samuel answered, "What pleases the Lord more, burnt offerings and sacrifices, or obedience to His voice? It is better to obey than to sacrifice. It is better to listen to God than to offer the fat of sheep. Disobedience is as bad as the sin of sorcery. Pride is as bad as the sin of worshiping idols. You have rejected the Lord's command. Now He rejects you as king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I didn't obey the Lord's commands and your words. I was afraid of the people, and I did what they said. Now I beg you, forgive my sin. Come back with me so I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to Saul, "I won't go back with you. You rejected the Lord's command, and now He rejects you as king." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught his robe and he tore it. And it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors who is better than you. The Lord is the eternal one of Israel. He does not lie or change His mind. He is not a human being, so He does not change His mind." Saul answered, "I have sinned. But please honor me in front of the elders of my people and in front of the Israelites. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me King Agag of the Amalekites." Agag came to Samuel in chains, but Agag thought, "Surely the threat of death has passed." Samuel said to him, "Your sword made other mothers lose their children. Now your mother will have no children." And Samuel cut Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left and went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his home in Gibeah. And Samuel never saw Saul again the rest of his life. But he was sad for Saul. The Lord was very sorry He had made Saul king of Israel. Perhaps one of the saddest chapters we can read in all of Scripture. And it would be easy for us to become somewhat frightened by Saul's example when we look at his flaws, when we look at his weaknesses. That perhaps we concern ourselves that maybe our own flaws, our own weaknesses may one day cause us to be like Saul. That we might be rejected by God. That we might go too far. But I don't want to frighten us this morning. I want us to look and learn from Saul's life, so that you and I don't fall into the same kind of trap that plagued Saul, his life. I want to put before you this morning that Saul's basic problem was that he was unwilling to trust God. And because he was unwilling to trust God, he found it impossible to obey God. And so we begin with, first of all, Saul was unwilling to trust God. This spiral for Saul, really in the military sense, began back a couple chapters earlier in 1 Samuel chapter 13. The nation of Israel, with Saul as their leader, was going to go into battle. And they had arranged a day and a time when Samuel was going to come and offer sacrifices. And then the army and Saul would go into battle. Saul and the army, the nation of Israel, became impatient, waiting for Samuel. The Philistine army became bigger and bigger, and the armies of Israel became agitated. And in their agitation, Saul felt the best thing that he could do was offer the sacrifices rather than waiting for Samuel to come and offer them. He did that because he didn't trust God to be with him. He did that because he didn't trust God that in this deteriorating situation that God would be able to still provide victory for the nation of Israel. He simply was unwilling to trust God and to trust God in His ability to accomplish what God said He would do. And so really by the time we read this account, we understand that Saul is not only afraid of enemies, but he's afraid of people. For Saul said to Samuel, I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. I think you and I can learn that that's a very good indicator for when we're starting to not trust in God, is when we can have more concern for the opinion of man than we do for the opinion of God. I'm not saying we shouldn't seek out the wise voices of wisdom and knowledge and experience, and when we face decisions and circumstances, to be able to get all the information and everything we can. But I think first and foremost we have to remember that our trust is in God and not in man. And so our concern first is God's view, not man's view. We even see this with Saul, that once he confessed his sin, it seems like he hasn't completely learned, because he still wants a good appearance before the people. We read there, Saul said, I knew I was going to have that happen at least once. Saul said, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. He still wanted the appearance before the people that he was okay, that God's blessing was still upon him. And yet all the way back from chapter 13 through now to this culmination here in chapter 15, Saul was not trusting God, was not believing God. His focus was not on God. His focus was not on obedience to God and what God had said. Because Saul was unwilling to trust God, we see that Saul could not obey God. You see, it's so difficult to obey God if we don't trust God. But if we can trust in God, obedience to God becomes so much easier. Saul so clearly demonstrates that for us. As I mentioned, Saul's military spiral began back in chapter 13. He took over. It was his plans, not God's plans. And so we find here again when Samuel comes to approach him. Saul says, listen, the Lord bless you, Samuel. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. I don't know if Saul just said that. I don't know if Saul had convinced himself internally, that indeed he had completely obeyed the Lord. What I do know is that Saul had a different definition for what God said as far as to destroy everything. His definition of everything was different than God's definition of everything. And if Saul had been able to trust God, he would have been able to obey God. For trust is the foundation upon which obedience is built. God had commanded that everything of the Amalekites would be killed and destroyed. Go and attack the Amalekites. Totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Destroy, the word destroy here, the Hebrew meaning of it carries with that idea of irrevocably turning it over to God. Irreversibly, that kind of thing where, you give it and there's no way you can take it back. And that's the Hebrew concept here, is that he wanted the nation of Israel to completely wipe out anything that had to do with the Amalekites. So there would be nothing left. It's that idea of giving it to God, taking hands off. I think I've told the story before, but in one of the churches we served in, there was a rather large painting behind the pulpit area, and there was a cloth that had been draped over it. Just kind of laid over it, not, as far as I would say decoratively or anything. It just kind of was there. And we had thought at the time that the windows would look nice with some kind of pleats or whatever along the top, and perhaps that fabric would be a nice thing to use to kind of, because it matched the carpet and everything else, and we weren't really sure that just having it hanging over the painting was appropriate. Well, we had the mistake of somebody saying we should ask the family who donated it 20 or 30 years previously, who's no longer any family members, had been attending for at least a decade or more, what they felt. Well, in doing so, they said, no, if it's not going to be draped over the painting, we want it back. You can't take it and use it for something else. Well, that's the opposite of this word in Hebrew that carries the idea of destroy. You give something, hands off, let it go. It's given. No take-backs kind of thing. And that's what God called Saul and the nation of Israel to do, was to, with the Amalekites, people and possessions, completely annihilate them so that there is no way that Israel could pull them back or hold them back. Now, I don't know, and Scripture doesn't really tell us. We could be maybe a little skeptical that, seeing these were the best animals, that the nation of Israel and Saul were indeed thinking of taking those best animals back and making sacrifices at Gilgal, or at least sacrificing all of them. Perhaps they were. We'll give them a little bit of credit that way. However, King Agag, there's no explanation for him as to why they let him live. They could not rationalize it. The bottom line is that obedience to God meant that they should have completely destroyed the Amalekites in their land where God had commanded them to do. And anything short of that was disobedience by Saul. And because of that disobedience by Saul, perhaps one of the most famous verses of Scripture comes to us in verse 22, where we learn that God desires obedience over sacrifice. Those words that Samuel said to Saul, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord?" I don't know if Saul realized this was a rhetorical question, but Samuel didn't give him much of a chance to think about it or respond. He simply gave the answer. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. All of Saul's weak excuses, everything that he tried to tell Samuel as to why they did what they did, and ultimately why Saul did what he did, Samuel responds and says, this is God's character. This is God's desire. He's not worried about the sacrifices. He wants spirits that are humble. He wants those who are devoted. He wants those to be obedient, that are His. It's interesting here that This is a very public sin that Saul committed. And he wanted to just privately confess it to Samuel. We see that the second king, King David, would take the opposite approach, where it was a private sin with Bathsheba. But he publicly confessed it. In fact, in that confession of his sin with Bathsheba, David was driven really to write, "You do not delight in sacrifice," referring to God, "or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise." David as king could have probably had all the livestock in all of Israel and sacrificed it to God, but David understood that didn't matter to God. What mattered in regards to restoring his relationship with God was a broken heart, a spirit that was open to him, and obedience to what God wanted. And that's what God has always asked of his people. When God called the nation of Israel out of Egypt, all he said to them is now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. To stay in that position of blessing within God's sight, he simply said to the Israelites, obey me fully. The wisest man perhaps to live on earth, Solomon, said, to do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Obedience. Obedience. And then God, through the prophet Jeremiah, said, for when I brought your ancestors out of Egypt and spoke to them, I did not just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this command. Obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in obedience to all I command you, that it may go well with you. And the truth of Scripture is the fact that God is faithful to His Word. Do you want things to go well for you in your life? It's not sacrifice. It's not giving. It begins with obeying completely. Do you want to live a life that is blessed by the Almighty? Then trust God and be obedient to Him and His Word. That's what He asks of us. That's what He calls us to do. That's what He's waiting for us to respond with, is obedience. Now, it would be easy to finish up and walk out with Saul being this downcast, prideful individual. But I think Scripture does him a little justice, maybe as a balancing act. For we read there in verse 31, so Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. There's hope. No matter how far off track we get, there's hope. We can come back. No matter how many times we fail to obey God, there's a way back. And we can worship Him. When our trust has failed, there is a way back where we can still worship Him, because He is available to us and still desires that we would worship Him, live in relationship with Him. Pick up from whatever point it is and begin again and obey Him. Yes, ultimately the story of Saul is a tragic one, yet God left it for us within His Word in order for you and I to learn from Saul's example. Let's pray.